What if everything you thought you knew about Mary was only half the truth, and the real story is darker, deeper, and way more shocking than anyone ever admitted? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, your entire perspective will flip. And if you love uncovering hidden truths and real drama, hit subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what's coming next. Mary has always been a mystery in the world she lives in, because on one side, you see a woman who walks into any business setting and instantly builds trust, connections, and loyalty. And yet, when you look at her role inside her own family, the picture feels completely different, almost like you are looking at two separate realities that should not exist at the same time. And this contrast is what pulls people in, because it forces a deeper question that refuses to go away. How can someone be so valued and appreciated by people outside her home and yet feel so isolated, misunderstood, and even rejected within the very place that is supposed to provide unconditional support and belonging? And as we begin to explore this story, it becomes clear that the answer is not simple, and it is not rooted in surface-level personality traits, but instead buried deep within years of emotional patterns, unspoken rules, and shifting expectations that slowly shaped the way Mary was seen and treated over time. And the more you look at it, the more you start to notice that Mary did not just wake up one day and become the person people describe her as, but rather she was placed into a role that she was expected to fulfill. And once she stepped into that role, there was no easy way out, because every action she took began to reinforce the narrative that had already been created around her. And this is where the story begins to take on a darker tone, because it reveals how easily a person can become defined by a system that does not allow room for growth or change. And Mary became known as the strict one, the enforcer, the one who upheld discipline and structure. And while that role may have been necessary within a large family, it also came with consequences, because it created distance, it created tension, and it made her the easiest target when something went wrong. And over time, this role stopped being something she did and started becoming who she was in the eyes of others. And once that shift happened, every interaction, every disagreement, every moment of frustration was filtered through that lens, making it almost impossible for her to be seen in any other way. And this is where the emotional weight of her story begins to build, because behind that label, there was a person who was experiencing her own struggles, her own insecurities, and her own unmet needs. But those parts of her were rarely acknowledged, because the focus was always on how she affected others rather than how the environment was affecting her. And as the family continued to grow, the dynamics became more complicated, and the introduction of new relationships brought new layers of comparison, competition, and emotional displacement. And instead of addressing those feelings openly, they were often minimized or ignored, which created a pattern where Mary learned that expressing vulnerability did not lead to comfort, but instead led to dismissal. Her to constantly prove her value while simultaneously limiting her ability to do so. And that kind of contradiction creates an emotional trap where no matter what she does, it is never quite enough. And this is where the concept of shifting expectations comes into play, because the standards she was held to were not always clear or consistent. And when expectations change without warning, it creates confusion, self-doubt, and a constant sense of instability. And this instability becomes the backdrop of her interactions, shaping the way she communicates, the way she defends herself, and the way she connects with others. And as the years pass, this pattern becomes so ingrained that it starts to feel normal, even when it is not. And this is where the story loops back on itself, because every new conflict feels like a continuation of the last, and every attempt to move forward is pulled back by unresolved issues that were never fully addressed. And this loop is what creates the sense of suspense, because you're always waiting to see if something will finally break the cycle, or if it will continue repeating in slightly different forms. And at the center of it all is Mary, trying to find her place, trying to understand her role, and trying to hold on to a sense of identity in a space that constantly challenges it. And while the family dynamic continues to create tension, there is another side of her life that tells a completely different story. And that is where things become even more compelling, because outside of the family, Mary is not defined by the same limitations. She is able to build relationships that are based on mutual respect, shared understanding, and genuine care. And in those spaces, she is not the enforcer or the difficult one. She is simply herself. And that version of her is someone people are drawn to, someone they trust, and someone they want to support. And this contrast is impossible to ignore, because it shows that the issue may not be who Mary is, but rather the environment she has been in for so long. And this realization adds another layer of depth to the story, because it shifts the focus from blaming the individual to examining the system. And once you start looking at it that way, everything begins to change. The moments that once seemed like proof of her flaws start to look like responses to pressure, and the behaviors that were labeled as negative start to make sense within the context of her experience. And this does not mean that every action is justified, but it does mean that there is more to the story than what is immediately visible. And this is what keeps the audience engaged, because it challenges assumptions, it invites curiosity, and it creates a sense. As the story continues to unfold, the tension surrounding Mary does not fade. Instead, it deepens, because every new interaction, every conversation, and every reflection seems to circle back to the same unresolved question. Was Mary truly the problem, or was she simply the most visible expression of a much larger dysfunction that no one wanted to confront? And this is where the narrative becomes even more gripping, because it forces us to look beyond individual moments and start connecting patterns that have been quietly repeating for years. And once you begin to see those patterns, it becomes almost impossible to ignore the way responsibility has been distributed within the family, and how often it seems to land on Mary regardless of the situation. And this repeated positioning slowly builds a narrative that feels real to those inside it, even if it is incomplete. And for Mary, living within that narrative means constantly navigating a version of herself that has already been defined by others. And this creates a psychological weight that is difficult to fully understand unless you consider what it means to exist in a space where your intentions are questioned, your emotions are minimized, and your efforts are rarely acknowledged in a meaningful way. And over time, this kind of environment does not just affect how others see you, it begins to affect how you see yourself. And this is where the internal conflict starts to grow, because Mary is not only dealing with external perceptions, but also with the internal struggle of trying to reconcile who she believes she is with who she is being told she is. And that gap between identity and perception becomes a source of constant tension, influencing her reactions, her decisions, and her ability to trust both herself and the people around her. And as this internal conflict intensifies, it creates moments where her responses may seem disproportionate or confusing to those who are only seeing the surface. But when you take into account the years of accumulated experiences, those reactions begin to make more sense, because they are not isolated incidents, they are echoes of a much longer story that has been building quietly in the background. And this is what adds depth to the narrative, because it transforms what could be seen as simple conflict into something far more complex and emotionally charged. And as viewers begin to pick up on these layers, the sense of suspense increases, because there is a growing awareness that there are pieces of the story that have not yet been fully revealed. And that awareness keeps people watching, keeps them analyzing, and keeps them questioning what might come next. And at the same time, there is a noticeable shift happening in Mary's life that introduces a new dynamic into the story. And that shift comes from the relationships she has built outside of the family, where the rules are different, the expectations are clearer, and the support feels consistent and genuine. And in those spaces, Mary is able to experience something that has been largely absent from her life within the family, and that is the feeling of being seen, heard, and valued without conditions. And this contrast does not just highlight the differences between her two worlds, it also creates a sense of possibility because it shows that the version of herself that exists outside of the family is not only valid, but also capable of thriving. And this realization becomes a turning point because it introduces the idea that the narrative she has been living in is not the only one available to her. And that thought alone carries a powerful sense of both hope and uncertainty, because while it opens the door to change, it also requires her to confront the reality of what staying in the same environment might mean for her future. And this is where the emotional stakes become even higher, because change is not just about making a different choice, it is about redefining identity, letting go of familiar patterns, and stepping into a space that may feel unknown and unpredictable. And for someone who has spent decades within a specific structure, that kind of shift can feel overwhelming, even if it is ultimately beneficial. And this is what keeps the narrative so engaging, because it is not just about what is happening on the surface, it's about the internal journey that Mary is going through as she begins to question long-held beliefs, reassess her relationships, and consider what she truly wants for herself. Forward, and every step in that process is filled with tension because there's always the possibility of retreating back into what is familiar, even if it is not healthy. And this push and pull between growth and comfort creates a loop that mirrors the earlier patterns in her life, but with one key difference. And that difference is awareness, because now there's a growing recognition of the dynamics at play. And that awareness has the potential to change everything if it is acted upon. And as the story progresses, the question is no longer just about how others see Mary, but about how she chooses to see herself and what she decides to do with that understanding. And this shift in focus adds a new layer of suspense because it introduces the possibility of transformation. And with transformation comes unpredictability. And that unpredictability is what keeps viewers invested because there is no clear outcome. There is no guaranteed resolution, only a series of choices that will shape what comes next. And as those choices begin to unfold, the narrative continues to build on itself, drawing connections between past and present, highlighting moments of growth and moments of hesitation, and reinforcing the idea that change is rarely linear and often comes with setbacks as well as progress. And this realistic portrayal of personal evolution adds authenticity to the story, making it more relatable and more compelling because it reflects the complexities of real life, where decisions are influenced by a combination of emotion, experience, and circumstance. And as Mary moves forward, there's a sense that the story is reaching a critical point where something has to shift. Whether that shift comes in the form of redefining her role within the family, strengthening her independence outside of it, or finding a balance between the two remains uncertain. But what is clear is that the patterns that once defined her are no longer as fixed as they once seemed, and that alone creates a sense of anticipation because it suggests that the cycle may finally be disrupted and that the narrative that has been repeating for so long might be on the verge of change. And as viewers, we are left watching closely, not just to see what happens, but to understand how it happens, because in that process, there's insight into the nature of relationships, the impact of environment, and the resilience required to step outside of a story that has been written over years and begin to write a new one. And that is where the true power of this narrative lies, not just in the drama or the conflict, but in the possibility of transformation. And the question that continues to linger is whether Mary will fully embrace that possibility, or whether the pull of the past will keep her tethered to the very patterns she is beginning to outgrow. And until that question is answered, the story remains open, looping back through moments of reflection, tension, and change, inviting viewers to stay engaged, to keep questioning, and to witness the unfolding of a journey that is as unpredictable as it is deeply human. So now the real question is,